This video, we're going to talk about market interventions. Now, we know that the competitive market creates an efficient outcome. It creates an efficient allocation of resources. When we're in equilibrium, we have a balance between the supply and demand, between the plans of suppliers and the plans of buyers, and resources go to their highest value uses. Now, we can go back to Adam Smith and the Wealth of Nations. He talked about there being an invisible hand, meaning that this system, this market system, doesn't really need to be controlled or guided by anyone. It winds up producing this beneficial result, this efficient allocation of resources, as if there was an invisible hand guiding it. But certainly, there's not. We also know from Friedrich Hayek and from his article, The Use of Knowledge in Society, that the market system, and specifically the price system, helps us overcome problems with knowledge, with information. And in fact, this information and knowledge that the market depends upon is not really given to any one person in any one central place. It's not given to anyone in totality. And yet, because we have the price system operating in competitive markets, the right amount of information becomes communicated. The price system acts like a communication system to communicate all the relevant information. And so we can say that the market and the price system acts to coordinate the separate actions of countless individuals who never meet each other. You don't really have to have all of the knowledge of all the relevant facts, but you see prices that are higher and lower, and it causes you to take actions which are beneficial from an economic standpoint. So the person enjoying this coffee here on the right doesn't have to know about the roaster and all of their business dynamics and problems and issues, nor the grower and what's going on with the weather and different things that are going on where they grow coffee beans that eventually get roasted and drank and enjoyed by the consumer. And so the connection between these folks is the market, and more specifically, the connection between the information is the price system. Competitive markets also rely upon profits and losses. Profits and losses play an important role. When a company makes a profit, it enables them to serve the customer's needs. They can use the proceeds of the profit to expand their operations and develop new products. And similarly, the companies that are losing money are discouraged from expanding their operations, usually have to shrink them. And so the profit and loss system winds up creating a reward rather for profitable companies, but it also is the way that we as consumers can guide the market. When we spend money with companies that are able to make a profit, that means they're serving us and serving our needs well, and then they're able to expand their production of goods and services and do more of what makes us happy. So when we consider all this, we know that the market and price system, competitive markets, allocate resources in a way that creates the highest standard of living for the largest number of people. But what happens when markets fail? Market failure usually manifests itself as either a shortage or a surplus of products that we weren't anticipating, or maybe higher prices or lower prices than we were anticipating. And so governments often intervene when the market delivers what appears to be an inefficient outcome, and they have a number of ways they can intervene. They can intervene by trying to set a price, that's control a price to make it higher or lower than the market would, to set the output at an amount that's higher or lower than the market would, to create transfer payments either through taxes or subsidies, and then various regulations. All these are ways that the government can intervene when they believe that the market has generated an outcome that is either inefficient or undesirable. So let's take a look at some of these interventions and see what they look like. The first type of intervention is a price control, in this case a price floor, and the minimum wage is a great example of a price control, a price floor. Now, we know the kind of motivation behind creating a minimum wage. We think that people may not be making enough money, and we think that on an abstract level, we think people should be making more money, and so we set a minimum wage with the idea of helping those people make more wages, make more money. But what's the unintended consequences? Well, minimum wages create unemployment. So if we look at our supply and demand graph here, if we start out at E1, this equilibrium point, we have a quantity of labor at QE, a wage rate at PE, and that's the equilibrium point. When we set the wage higher than that, we go up to the PMW, the minimum wage. Well, at that price, there's a lot more people wanting to work at these higher wages. So the supply of workers is great, but the demand for workers is much lower. So we wind up being at an equilibrium of E2, the amount of labor that employers demand is this lower amount at E2. And so, sure, some people get a higher wage. They're depicted in this box A. So these are the people that are still working with the higher wage, and they get this higher wage here. They get the minimum wage. But the people in box B, these are people that used to work, that no longer work. So they don't get the higher wage. In fact, they don't get any wage at all. And the last thing to note is that employers now have an incentive to replace employees with automation. Maybe the amount of employees that they can afford to pay at E2 is not really optimal for their business. Well, they can then look at ways to replace employees with automation, and of course they don't have to pay the automation in this case might be a machine or a robot or something like that, and they wouldn't be subject to any minimum wages because they're not employees, they're not people. But the impacts of a minimum wage don't really end there. We can look at just a simple situation similar to what's gone on in many states in the recent past. So minimum wages went up from about $8 to $10 or $12 an hour, and they currently sit around $12 an hour. In some places they're actually even a little higher. And so what happens to the products that we all see in the marketplace that we have when minimum wages rises? What happens to us as consumers? Well, we can see just an example here. If we look at a shirt being made and sold in a marketplace for $25, and we assume that there's 1 hour of labor that goes into the shirt just to keep things simple, well, you can see that the 1 hour of labor is in the shirt, and then we have to buy the material for the shirt and be involved in distribution. This is the money for profit, and eventually we get to the price of $25. That's where the cost of the shirt or the price of the shirt that we see is made up of these components, including 1 hour of labor at $8. If we now increase that 1 hour of labor to $12 an hour because we passed a minimum wage law, well, let's assume the other things don't change. Well, we've added $4 to the price of the shirt, and so it's now $29, or it's 16% higher than it was before. So even the people who receive the minimum wage are now, when they go to buy a product in the marketplace, are facing products that are 16% higher than they were before the increase in minimum wage. But it really doesn't stop there, because of course there's labor involved in producing material, there's labor involved in distribution, so those prices will also costs will also go up, and so the $25 shirt is now at least going to cost $30.92. So the price increase is around 25%, and the important point to note here is that even the people who receive the minimum wage are facing higher prices, and of course the people who lost their job because they're not being employed at the higher minimum wage, they're still facing higher prices as well. But then you have to ask yourself, well, if we can make the wage $12 by just signing a law, why stop at 12? Why not make it 50 or $100 per hour or even more? And so I just took an example here, the same example we use, and plugged $50 in for the hourly wage, and you can see that $25 shirt, just based on the increased wages, is now $67 when you add in the labor costs and the increased labor costs for the other pieces in the value chain, creating the material and distribution, that kind of thing. Well, the price then goes up to $75. So there's the the unintended consequences of interfering with the market and interfering with the prices is twofold. One, some of the people who used to work are now unemployed, and two, the products that people have to buy in the marketplace, even the people with who received the higher minimum wage, are now much higher than they were before the change in the minimum wage. We can we mentioned the third aspect, which is over time employers are going to look for ways to replace labor with automation. Here's an example from the Los Angeles Times about a machine that essentially makes burgers, some sort of a machine or robot that makes burgers. Instead of having an employee do it, you'd have a machine do it. And the hourly cost of having the machine do it is $3 per hour, certainly a lot less than they're paying the employee. This is also true with skilled labor. Here's a machine that will hang and finish drywall, which is a skilled task that machines and automation can be used for. And then lastly, it's not just that type of work, but office work. Here's an example of software robots that are used to do basic tasks. In this case, it's basic accounting tasks like posting journal entries and things like that. So, all of this is what will result in the longer term when you interfere in the market with wage rates. You create an incentive for employers to look for other ways to accomplish the tasks that don't involve labor. Now, we can look at the opposite of a price floor and look at a price ceiling. An example of this might be rent control. There's rent control in places like New York City and in San Francisco, I think, and also in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and a few cities around the country. And so, again, the idea is that rents are too high. If we put a limit on the rents, then will help the people who are trying to rent the apartments and make them more affordable. But what's the unintended consequences? Well, rent control creates a shortage of apartments. Sure, some people get a lower rent. If we look at our situation here, we have an equilibrium at E1, but when we lower the rent we create a floor, the rent could be no higher than this rent control, this purple line here. Well, many more people will demand apartments, but it will create a shortage because the amount of apartments that will be supplied is over here at E2. And we can see that at E2, it's a reduction in the amount of apartments. So sure, the people in box A will get lower rents, but there's less apartments available on the whole. And one of the things, how does that happen? Well, some people who used to rent apartments, the people here along this blue line, at the lower rents, they're not interested in renting them as apartments. Maybe they'll convert them to office space. Maybe if it's a second place that they have, they'll keep it for their own use. There's lots of alternatives that they can pursue instead of lowering the rent. So the result of this is that rent control creates a shortage of apartments. There's less apartments after we create the price ceiling. Some of the interventions don't really involve prices, but they might involve setting limits or mandates on the amount that's produced. So we can look at a production limit. You can imagine that there's no drilling for oil allowed in offshore in certain places, or maybe in places like Alaska because of environmental concerns. And the economics of this are pretty straightforward. We know when there are production limits that it's going to raise prices. So if we set a production limit here at a quantity PL, well, that's much less than the equilibrium quantity in the competitive market. So we have lost production equal to box A here. That's oil that never gets produced or refined, and the oil that does get drilled and gets produced is produced at a much higher price because this smaller amount of oil goes to the people who are willing to pay this much higher price on the upper part of the demand curve. So when we limit production of something, where the economics of us tell us that we're also going to be raising prices. Now, the opposite is true for a production mandate. The opposite meaning the production mandate is the opposite of a production limit. Here we're saying that the amount that the market produces is not enough and we have to have more. An example of this might be the Affordable Care Act that basically wanted to make sure that every American had health insurance. So the market produced a certain amount of health insurance equal to QE at a certain price equal to PE, but we want to, the production mandate says, we want to make sure that everyone, not just a larger quantity of people, have access to insurance. So the quantity moves to QM, the quantity with the mandate. And in this case, it certainly does increase the quantity. We move from QE to QM, but there are other unintended consequences. At QM, the price that demanders demand is all the way down here on the demand curve. So they want to pay this lower price, a price much lower than the market was generating. But what do suppliers want to produce that amount QM? Well, they want to be all the way up here. So we have this gap between the price required by suppliers to supply QM and the price required by demanders to buy QM. And so this has to be reconciled some way. In the case of usually this gets reconciled with some sort of a subsidy that goes either directly to the supplier or to the supplier through the demander, also in the case of the Affordable Care Act, this was also handled through the individual mandate, requiring some of the people on this lower part of the curve to buy it, whether they wanted it or not. There's another factor here. You'll notice that the price gets driven down with this subsidy, and in general, what happens is there's sometimes there's a transfer. The people who were willing to pay more now can pay a lower amount, and so there's a transfer from buyers from buyers to taxpayers in order to have this lower amount. And that's what a production mandate looks like. Now we can look more specifically at the Affordable Care Act of 2010. And again, you can see President Obama signing it here with many dignitaries surrounding him. The goal of this was to expand medical coverage to 30 million people who didn't have health insurance, which is a noble goal, or so you can understand why someone would want that. And the second goal here, and this is the one that's interesting from an economic standpoint, is they also wanted to lower the cost of health insurance in health care. So we wanted to add more people to the health insurance rolls, and we wanted to lower the cost of health insurance in health care. So if we look at our supply and demand graphs and kind of model the intervention, we can see on the top we have the model for the model for health insurance. On the bottom we have the market for health care itself. Up top we had the equilibrium was 285 million people and a price equal for 285 million people. When we had the production mandate, everybody had to get it either through the individual mandate or through the subsidies. The insurance companies needed this higher price. The people who the demanders, the people purchasing health insurance, needed this lower price, and so this gap was covered by the combination of the individual mandate and really more of the subsidies. The individual mandate was eventually eliminated. It was largely unworkable for lots of different reasons, but it eventually was eliminated, and so now this gap here is made up by subsidies. Taxpayers pay for this ultimately, and that's how we have more people insured. Now, what happens in the health insurance market? Well, when we're providing subsidies, that's an increase in income to the people. We know that when there's an increase in income, the demand curve will shift out, and we'll be at a point where we have a greater amount of people being covered, and we have at higher prices in the market for health care. So what happens after the Affordable Care Act? Well, the price of health insurance and the price of health care both increase. And sure enough, when we go and look a number of years later, that's exactly what we saw, that the price of health care especially and the price of health insurance had increased. So our model, which we used to predict what would happen from an economic standpoint, was largely verified when we went in the market a number of years later and saw what happened to the prices of healthcare and the price of health insurance. Now, we can look at another type of intervention, which is a sales tax. A sales tax was when we pay taxes on the goods and services that we buy. Now, what happens is the sales tax is basically in addition to the price. So, having sales taxes means that there's less sales. Without the tax, the prices will be lower. When prices are lower, we know from the law of demand that the amount demanded would be higher, and so we would have a larger quantity being bought and sold in the marketplace without sales taxes. When we add sales taxes, we move from E1 to E2, which is a lower point, a point on the demand curve that involves a lesser quantity. And so there's a certain amount of sales that don't happen because the sales tax adds to the price of products. And of course, what's in box A is revenue that goes to the government. Eventually, if this sales tax is permanent or over the long term, this will represent a lesser income to people, and so the demand for products and goods and services in general will shift down. Demand will be decreased. Of course, the revenue goes to the government. They'll be able to spend more money on things in the government sector, and so we have a decline in the private sector in terms of the amount of goods and services that are being sold, an increase in the government sector in the amount of goods and services being sold, and at best it might be they might equal out. That's assuming that we have kind of good government and efficient government. But the government really is not wasteful and that type of thing. And maybe to the extent that it's not, then the amount in A will be goes to the government from an effectiveness standpoint will be less than the amount in box B in terms of the lost amount of sales. Now we can look at income taxes as another iteration of this when we have income taxes or higher income taxes. Well, that's less income for the public. The demand goes from the red line to the purple line here. We move from E1 to E2, and if you notice, E2 involves a lesser quantity of goods and services being sold, and at a lower price. The prices go down, and there's a lesser quantity and lower prices. Now, presumably, again, like I mentioned in the previous example, there's an increase in government purchase elsewhere with the revenue that comes from income taxes, but with regards to the private sector part of this, the income taxes reduce demand in the private sector. When we have reduced demand, we have lower quantities and lower prices. Now let's look at kind of the opposite. Instead of taking away money from the private sector from citizens, we'll look at the case of subsidies, where we're adding or giving money to people in the private sector. What happens when we do that? Well, if you subsidize something, if you subsidize anything, you get more of it at higher prices. The subsidy is incremental income. Incremental income results in increased demand. We move from point E1 to E2 on the curve here. We have an increase in demand. This is the demand curve after the subsidy, and this represents a higher quantity and higher prices. So both the quantity of goods and services that get bought and sold in the market is greater, and the prices for these goods and services is higher. And this is what happens with subsidies for healthcare or subsidies for college and things like that. And sure enough, if we go and look, we see that when we have these subsidies, we have, let's take the example of college. We have subsidies that go towards college students to help pay for tuition. Well, more people go to college, and the price of college is higher than it was before the subsidies. Now, the point in all of this is that market interventions create unintended consequences. Setting an above market minimum price, such as the minimum wage, creates a surplus. It creates unemployment. Some people will make higher wages, but other people who were working in the past will not work in the future. Setting a below market price, like a rent control, creates a shortage. And again, the people who are able to keep an apartment or have an apartment pay a lower price, but there's more people who don't have an apartment at all. When we limit the quantity of a product or service that can be produced or sold, such as in a production mandate, well, then we're always going to have higher prices as a result. And if you subsidize something, and if you subsidize anything, you can be sure that you're going to have more of it, and they're going to be at higher prices. But not all market interventions involve price or quantity or making taking taxes or subsidies. Some interventions involve regulations, rulings, laws, what businesses people are allowed to operate in, requirements for licensing and permits and codes and zoning and various fees. So there's lots of other ways that the government can intervene into the market, and so that also create unintended consequences. We can think about the competitive market being an environment that allows entrepreneurs to be innovative. And this process of innovation involves a large number of trials and errors that are coordinated by competitive markets. So we have a capital structure, and some of the capital in the market gets allocated to existing companies, the existing ideas, the big companies that we know about through the stock market, so they can continue their operations. And then some of the capital in the market gets allocated to startups, to new businesses, new ideas, new technologies. And so the market creates a balance that balances the amount of resources going to existing ideas and and hopefully the realization of new ideas. So the amount there's a certain amount of capital that goes to startups and a certain amount of capital that goes to going concerns. When the government interferes, either through interest rates or maybe through regulations of taxes or maybe by deciding what kinds of businesses can exist and what kind of contracts can exist. Well, the balance between existing ideas and future ideas, between the present and the future, is disruptive. Now, we can see some of this playing out right now. The combination of the internet and new technologies has allowed us new businesses to flourish. Companies like Uber and Airbnb offering ride-sharing services or apartment sharing services. We have delivery companies, lots of these things which are new or different ways for us to get from point A to point B, or stay overnight somewhere, or get something delivered to us. But these new business models, these new business companies have been treated very harshly by regulatory authorities. Uber, in particular, seems to be the governments and regulatory authorities are trying to decide what they can, where they can operate, and how they, whether the employees, whether the people who drive the Uber cars are employees or are they independent contractors. And so there's been lots of back and forth on that. The same thing with Airbnb. Lots of people don't want Airbnb in their neighborhood, in their area. Despite the fact that we all want to go and have alternatives to hotels by using services like Airbnb. So there's been this kind of tension between these new ideas, new business models, and governments and regulatory authorities. The state of New Jersey is wants to tax the gig employees who work at these types of companies or in these kind of places as if they were employees, even though they're technically not employees. Why do they want to do that? Because they don't want to lose the revenue that they get from being able to have employees paying to things like unemployment insurance and different things like that. So there's many obstacles to these new businesses and new business models, and so this type of these are also market interventions, and they also have unintended consequences. One of the unintended consequences is in the case of the gig workers, and some laws in California that basically said these folks have to be treated as employees. They cannot be treated as independent contractors. So one of the unintended consequences is there's a whole bunch of people who wanted these flexible work situations, who benefited from these flexible work situations, they don't want to be employees, and now they're kind of losing the ability to decide that for themselves. They're having to um, uh, the government is interfering there, and in fact, you can look at one example here. One company, Vox Media, had a bunch of people covering events in California. They basically told the people who worked for them in California, the contractors, that they could no longer work for them. And they covered events in California from nearby states, Arizona and Nevada and things like that. So um, there's another example of an unintended consequence. If I lived in California and worked for Vox Media, I either lost my job or had to move someplace where I probably didn't want to live. And this played out recently in California. The Assembly bill passed, Assembly Bill 5. Governor Newsom there on the left signing it, basically saying that independent contractors are employees. Doesn't matter what agreement was made between the Uber drivers and the Lyft drivers and people like that. They have to be treated as employees with benefits and all sorts of things like that. And so after that happened, the it was put to a ballot initiative, Proposition 22, which basically Uber and Lyft were largely behind, but some other ones were also based. And what was the result of that? It passed. So Uber and Lyft drivers were exempt from AB5. Most of the bill was pointed at Uber and Lyft, and they were able to have a referendum and get around that. How this is going to play out in the longer run, we don't really know. It's still kind of in process, but I think it's just an interesting situation, and one that is a great example of how the government may have the best of intentions when they're intervening in a market, but they create unintended consequences, and oftentimes the unintended consequences create a situation that's worse than the one that they were trying to fix in the first place. Now, getting back to our original discussion, to a large extent, what we see here is that the capital structure of the economy is evolving. The capital structure of the economy is changing. If we look on the left here, we see really the capital structure that dominated for most of the Industrial Revolution, for most of the past 100 years. And you had, if you look at the outer bands as kind of new ideas and the inner bands as existing going concerns, well, a large amount of the capital went towards existing or going concerns that financed larger scale operations over a long period of time. And sure, there was always new ideas and innovation, but there was some sort of the distribution across new and existing looks something maybe like on the left. It's just an abstract version of that. But what happens if we live in a more entrepreneurial society? If transactions costs are lower, things like the internet allow us to spend more time and energy on new business models, new ideas, new value propositions. Maybe the capital structure needs change to look more like on the right, where you have you want to allow a lot more of these new businesses, new ideas, and new ventures to work themselves out through the innovation process, and maybe less capital needs to be allocated to existing ideas. This would be the case when you're in a period of rapid innovation, rapid development of new technologies, new ideas, and new business models. Well, if you intervene in the market and try to make it look like the capital structure on the left, you're going to have an imbalance or mismatch between the capital structure that exists and the capital structure that is needed, and you'll wind up allocating too much capital to the inner bands and not enough capital to the outer bands. And the summary of all this is that the problem with market interventions is that resources do not always go to their highest value uses. We know in a competitive market that buyers and sellers weigh the costs and benefits themselves. They allocate resources efficiently, and then in the end, the resources go to the highest valued uses. There's a balance in competitive markets between buyers and sellers that creates a high standard of living. Now, what happens when you have market interventions? Well, that interrupts voluntary exchanges. Costs and benefits are uncoupled from the actual transactions, and they can, costs especially can be transferred to other people. And so we don't resources don't necessarily go to their highest value uses, and so um, it, it it starts to the value proposition of competitive markets starts to break down when you start having market interventions, when you start interfering in markets with prices, with quantities, or through regulations and other ways of interfering with markets.